It began with the scent of dust and death. When Howard Carter's trembling hand first broke through the sealed door of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, a strange stillness swept through the Valley of the Kings. Candlelight flickered against walls painted with golden gods, their eyes unblinking, as if watching intruders disturb a slumber meant for eternity. Within days, rumors began to swirl through Cairo, men falling ill, others struck by fever or madness, and one by one, they died. Newspapers whispered one word in terror: curse. But the curse was older than Tutankhamun. For centuries, stories have been told of explorers, grave robbers, and scholars who sought gold in sacred places and found only death. They came for treasure. They left behind silence, as though the desert itself had swallowed them whole. Some say it was disease, others coincidence. Yet even now, a century later, archaeologists tread lightly where the sand covers secrets. Because in ancient Egypt, death was never the end. It was a realm guarded by gods and by vengeance. If you are drawn to real stories from the dark corners of history, where faith, superstition, and tragedy intertwine, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and join us as we descend into the tombs of ancient Egypt, where the dead never sleep. The night in the Valley of the Kings was never truly silent. Beneath the whispering wind, the sand shifted with the movement of unseen things. Beetles burrowing, stone cracking, perhaps even a faint echo of prayers uttered thousands of years ago. To stand there after dusk was to feel the weight of eternity pressing on your chest. The tombs, carved deep into the rock, were not merely graves. They were sanctuaries of the afterlife, homes built for kings who had conquered death. But where gold gleamed, greed followed. Long before modern archaeologists arrived with notebooks and lanterns, the first intruders came with chisels and desperation. They were not noble explorers or historians. They were men of dust and hunger, peasants, soldiers, slaves, each one lured by the stories of untold treasures sealed beneath the cliffs. Egypt's great necropolis was meant to be hidden, yet every rumor of gold drew another desperate soul into the darkness. They entered not knowing that to disturb a pharaoh's sleep was to invite the wrath of gods who never forgot. Inside the tombs, the air was thick, not with rot, but with something older: bitumen, resin, incense, the ancient preservatives of kings. The scent clung to their skin as they chipped through plaster and stone, whispering nervously to one another. They found amulets and statues first, small enough to slip into a satchel. But deeper in, the treasure became divine: golden masks, jewels that shimmer like captured sunlight, and scrolls inked with words forbidden to mortal tongues. In that moment, awe turned to terror, for in the flicker of their oil lamps, the painted eyes of Anubis, god of death, seemed to watch them move. Legends tell that some never made it out. The tunnels collapsed, sealing them alive with the very kings they sought to rob. Others fled into the night, their minds broken by what they had seen or what they believed they had awakened. Villagers spoke of sudden sicknesses, of men whose eyes turned pale before death, of families cursed for generations. Historians later found records on the walls of certain tombs, warnings carved by priests. Death will come on swift wings to him who disturbs the peace of king. Was it merely superstition, a trick of the desert mind? Or had the ancient embalmers truly bound spirits to guard the resting places of their masters? The thieves who lived long enough to tell their tales swore that something had followed them home, a shadow that would not lift, a whisper that echoed in dreams. In the Valley of the Kings, gold was never free. Every ounce was paid for in blood, fear, or the loss of one soul. By day, the valley was a furnace, the air shimmering above the stone like liquid fire. By night, it turned cold and haunted. Those who survived the raid spoke of the strange noises that echoed through the tunnels, the rasp of movement behind them, the sigh of air escaping sealed chambers, and the low hum of what they swore was chanting. To the villagers who lived nearby, it was simple: the tombs were alive. The dead did not sleep. They watched. One such tale came from the reign of Ramesses IX, whose priests recorded in secret the punishments of captured robbers. Under torchlight, they confess, their voices trembling, their skin blistered from the desert sun. They spoke of curses written in red ochre, of shadows that choked their breath, of snakes that seemed to appear from the very walls. Yet even as they trembled, others came again, drawn by greed stronger than fear. Egypt's riches were boundless, but so too was its hunger for forbidden gold. The tombs themselves were crafted to deceive. Hidden doors, false walls, labyrinthine corridors that twisted into darkness. Some robbers would die simply trying to find their way out, lost among murals of gods weighing the hearts of men. To die in such a place was to vanish into myth. There would be no burial rites, no prayers, no name spoken after death. The worst fate imaginable in Egyptian belief. For to be forgotten was to die twice. As centuries passed, the desert swallowed the valley once more. The entrances vanished beneath dunes and time. Empires rose and fell, languages changed, and the old gods were replaced by new ones. Yet still, beneath the cliffs, the tombs waited, sealed chambers filled with treasures untouched and warnings unheeded. When 19th century explorers rediscovered these resting places, they believed themselves immune to superstition. They came armed with science, shovels, and ambition. But the locals, watching from a distance, whispered to one another. They disturb what should remain still, the old women said. The spirits will remember. And indeed, in time, they did. For the tombs were not just homes for the dead. They were contracts written between man and eternity. To break them was to awaken something ancient, something that did not forgive. The desert had been patient. It would now reclaim what was stolen. In the ancient world, words were not merely symbols. They were life itself. The Egyptians called it Heka, the power that bound the universe together. Through words, gods created the world. Through words, kings secured their immortality. And through words, they cursed those who dared to disturb their rest. To inscribe a curse was not an act of poetry. It was warfare. Every line carved into stone was a weapon. Every hieroglyph the blade of divine vengeance sharpened by faith and fear. The earliest warnings appeared in the tombs of the Old Kingdom. Simple phrases at first. Beware the one who enters here, or the wrath of the gods shall strike the trespasser. But as the centuries passed and tomb raiders grew bolder, the warnings became darker, more elaborate, infused with the authority of gods whose dominion stretched beyond death. On the walls of certain tombs, priests etched promises of annihilation, blindness, madness, or the eternal devouring of one soul. They were not metaphors. To the Egyptians, the soul was real, a fragile essence that could be shattered, scattered, or consumed. Imagine standing in the torchlight, face to face with those words. The flickering flame making the hieroglyphs seem alive. The jackal-headed form of Anubis glinting in gold leaf. The vulture of Nekhbet hovering above a line that read, "All who enter without purity shall be struck down by the winged serpent of the West." To an outsider, it might have seemed myth, but to an ancient Egyptian, these were contracts sealed with divine authority. To violate them was to invite judgment not just from the priests, but from the gods themselves. And so, when thieves or foreign invaders breached these sacred spaces, it was said that their fates were sealed before they even touched the treasure. Some would stumble on the return journey, dying of fever or thirst. Others were found wandering, muttering the names of gods as if trying to appease something unseen. The priests of the time did not seek to prove these curses true. They knew it was not their place. For in Egypt, belief itself was power, and the spoken word could awaken what slept beneath the stone. It is said that even pharaohs feared the curses of their predecessors. When new kings built their tombs, they offered gifts to the ancient dead, libations of wine, incense, and gold, asking forgiveness for disturbing the ground once consecrated. They knew well that the boundary between the living and the dead was not sealed, only thin like the desert wind that whispered through the cracks of a forgotten tomb. The scribes who carved the walls of the royal tombs did not see themselves as artists. They were keepers of divine law. Each stroke of the chisel was a prayer, each symbol a spark of eternal power. They worked in silence, deep beneath the cliffs, by the dim light of oil lamps that hissed and smoked against the stone. Some carried charms around their necks, small amulets of lapis lazuli or carnelian, to protect them from the very words they carved. For even they believed that to speak or inscribe the name of a god carelessly was to summon its gaze. Among the most feared inscriptions were those in the Middle Kingdom, when tomb curses evolved into precise, almost legal threats. One fragment found near Saqqara warns, "He who shall defile this tomb will be judged by the council of the gods, his house destroyed, his body burned, his children erased from the earth." Another reads, "The crocodile is against him in the water, the serpent against him on land. He shall be without a tomb, without offerings, his soul devoured by flame." These were not empty words. They were engineered terrors, divine contracts written to echo through eternity. The priests of the afterlife cults believed that curses worked through Heka, the same sacred force that animated the cosmos. To curse was to twist a natural order, to command chaos in defense of balance. They painted eyes on sarcophagi, so the dead might see intruders coming. They sealed spells beneath layers of resin, so the voice of the tomb could never fade. Even the placement of statues, jackals at doorways, cobras at thresholds, was intentional. Each form was a sentinel of terror, ready to strike the unworthy. Some ancient records speak of cursed tombs that seem to defend themselves. In one story, a band of grave robbers broke into the burial chamber of an unnamed noble. They pried the lid from the sarcophagus, expecting jewels and gold. Instead, they found only linen and dust, and the words, "You will meet your death at dawn." By sunrise, a sandstorm struck the valley. None survived. When villagers found their bodies days later, they were buried again beneath the sand, as if the desert itself had swallowed them for their trespass. Even centuries later, when archaeologists began to rediscover these tombs, they reported the same strange feeling, an invisible weight in the air, a silence that pressed against the skin. Some called it superstition, others called it memory, for in Egypt, nothing sacred ever truly fades. The pharaohs may have died, but their words endured, sharp as obsidian, eternal as the sun that watched over their kingdom. And in those words, the warnings remain, waiting patiently for the next intruder who dares to read them aloud. When the sealed door to Tutankhamun's tomb was first breached on November 26, 1922, the air that escaped had not touched human lungs for over 3,000 years. Howard Carter stood at the threshold, a candle trembling in his hand. Behind him, Lord Carnarvon, his financier, waited breathlessly. Carter pressed his face close to the opening, his eyes wide with wonder. "Can you see anything?" Carnarvon whispered. Carter's voice, soft and awestruck, carried to the darkness. "Yes, wonderful things." But what neither man could see was a shadow that seemed to move with them as they entered, an unseen watcher that had waited in silence for centuries. Inside the tomb, gold gleamed like trapped sunlight. The air was heavy with the scent of resin and the faint sweetness of decay. Everywhere, there were signs of divine guardianship. Carved eyes, jackals, falcons, serpents coiled in eternal vigilance. Tutankhamun, the boy king, had slept in peace for millennia, and now the world had come to wake him. At first, the excavation was celebrated as the greatest archaeological discovery in history. Newspapers across the world filled their pages with the treasures of the young pharaoh. But as the days passed, celebration turned to unease. Strange accidents began to unfold. A cobra, sacred to the pharaohs, slithered into Carter's home in Cairo and devoured his pet canary, the very bird that had sung each morning since the tomb's opening. To the locals, this was no coincidence. The cobra was a symbol of the Egyptian monarchy, the royal protector. The message was clear. The pharaoh's guardian had struck the first blow. Soon after, Lord Carnarvon fell ill. It began as a small infection from a mosquito bite on his cheek, the same spot, some noted later, where Tutankhamun's mummy bore wound. Within days, the fever consumed him. He raved deliriously in his hotel room, whispering names in languages no one understood. On April 5, 1923, he died in Cairo as the city's lights suddenly went dark. Every bulb extinguished at once. At that exact moment, his dog, half a world away in England, let out a cry and fell dead. The newspapers needed no further proof. They printed the words that would echo through the ages. "Pharaoh's curse strikes." Carter dismissed it as superstition, but others were not so sure. Within months, more deaths followed, some from mysterious illnesses, others from sudden accidents. The pattern was impossible to ignore. It seemed as though those who had entered the tomb were marked, touched by a quiet, unstoppable hand. Fear began to spread like fever through the desert camps. Every creak of the tomb's scaffolding, every flicker of a candle flame, was met with wary eyes. Men who had once laughed at tales of ancient curses now refused to sleep inside the valley. They spoke of dreams, dark corridors, voices whispering their names, the cold touch of invisible hands brushing their faces in the night. The locals, who had always approached the tombs with reverence, shook their heads and said, "The gods are watching." Within months of Lord Carnarvon's death, others in the expedition met strange fates. George J. Gould, an American financier who visited the tomb shortly after its opening, died of a fever in France. Colonel Aubrey Herbert, Carnarvon's own half-brother, went blind and soon after followed him into the grave. Sir Archibald Douglas Reed, the radiologist who examined the pharaoh's mummy, succumbed unexpectedly to illness. By 1929, only 7 years after the tomb was opened, more than a dozen people connected to the excavation were dead, some of disease, some of unexplained causes. The British press turned it into legend. "Pharaoh's curse claims another victim," the headline screamed. Even the most rational minds could not fully escape the chill that followed each report. For how could so many deaths, so sudden and uncanny, be mere coincidence? Egyptologists and skeptics argued otherwise. They pointed to bacteria sealed within the tomb, ancient spores released into the air after centuries. Science explained infection, but it could not explain timing or fear. Howard Carter himself remained untouched by the curse, though he could never escape it. Those around him suffered misfortune after misfortune, accidents, illnesses, mysterious deaths. Carter dismissed them all, yet there were moments when even he seemed haunted. Visitors recalled him growing silent when the subject arose, his eyes distant, his voice tight. He had disturbed something magnificent and something terrible. When Carter finally died in 1939, 17 years after entering the tomb, some said the curse had waited patiently. His gravestone carried no mention of Tutankhamun, but those who visited his resting place in England often noted the strange stillness around it, as though, even in death, he was not entirely free. Historians continue to argue over what really happened in those years, disease, coincidence, or something older than reason. But the people of Egypt knew better. They whispered what their ancestors had always believed, that the dead remember. The Curse of Tutankhamun was not merely a story. It was a warning, a reminder that in Egypt, to touch eternity was to invite its wrath. And the boy king, silent in his golden coffin, had simply kept his promise. By the time the 20th century drew to its middle decades, the world was ready to tear down its own ghosts. The age of superstition was giving way to the age of science, and scholars sought to lift the veil from every mystery, even the curse of the pharaohs. Egyptologists, physicians, and historians all lined up to separate truth from legend, armed with microscopes, medical reports, and the firm conviction that reason could silence fear. Yet, beneath all their logic, the question lingered. Why did so many who entered Tutankhamun's tomb meet such strange and timely ends? The first explanation was biological. When Carter's team broke the ancient seals, they had also released an ecosystem trapped for millennia, air thick with mold spores, bacteria, and deadly microorganisms bred in darkness. Some scientists suggested that these pathogens, dormant on the tomb walls or within the wrappings of the dead, had found new hosts among the living. The theory seemed sound. The ancient embalmers had used resins, oils, and organic materials that could foster such growth. In a time before antibiotics, even a minor infection could be fatal. Still, the public wanted more than science. The image of the curse, silent, ancient, inevitable, was far too powerful to vanish under a microscope. Newspapers continued to feed the legend. Every archaeologist's death, no matter how ordinary, was stitched into the myth. A heart attack, the curse. A car accident, the curse. The story had taken on a life of its own, and the world, weary from war and loss, found strange comfort in the thought that some forces remained beyond control. Yet within the academic halls of Cairo and London, debate raged. Some scholars pointed out that many of those involved with the excavation lived long, uneventful lives. If the curse were real, why did it spare so many? Others argued that belief itself had killed, that fear and suggestion might have driven men to illness, madness, or misfortune. The human mind, they said, could make its own curses. And yet, despite every rational explanation, There remain moments that science could not reach. Coincidence is too perfect, death's too poetic, silence is too heavy to ignore. The more experts spoke against it, the more the myth endured, as if the curse itself resisted being buried. Perhaps that was its truest power, not the taking of lives, but the taking of certainty. For in the end, even the most skeptical, I cannot fully pierce the darkness of a tomb that has waited 3,000 years to be disturbed. The deeper scholars dug for truth, the more the mystery seemed to slip between their fingers. Egypt was changing, the empire's sand giving way to a modern nation. Yet the ghosts of its pharaohs refused to die quietly. Researchers from Britain, France, and America returned to the Valley of the Kings armed with gloves, respirators, and sterilizing agents, determined to prove that the curse was nothing more than ancient air turned toxic. But even with every precaution taken, accidents still happened. Equipment failed, fires broke out without cause, and in one instance, a young assistant was struck by falling debris from a tomb wall he had not even touched. He survived, barely, but swore afterward that just before the collapse, he heard something whisper his name from the dark. The rationalists dismissed him, as they dismissed so many others. Yet the pattern persisted, a slow, haunting rhythm that echoed through the years. Archaeologists laughed in public and prayed in private. Each expedition began with blessings and incense, not because they believed in the curse, they said, but because it was tradition. Still, one could sense unease behind their words. They were scientists, yes, but also men standing in chambers built for gods. Psychologists later described the Pharaoh's curse syndrome, a phenomenon where guilt, fear, and suggestion manifest as real sickness. The theory held that the sheer psychological pressure of disturbing the dead, coupled with media hysteria, might trigger breakdowns or physical ailments. It was a neat explanation, almost too neat. It placed the blame not on gods or germs, but on the human mind itself. Yet some events defied even that. One researcher, examining Tutankhamun's jewelry decades later, collapsed suddenly in his lab, his heart stopping without warning. Another, preparing a museum exhibition of the artifacts, was found dead the night before the opening. Both were healthy. Both had laughed off the notion of curses only days before. Coincidence, said the scientists. Proof, whispered the believers. And so, the debate endured, reason clashing with reverence, skepticism battling the unseen. The more science tried to strip the legend bare, the more it revealed about human nature itself. Our hunger for control, our terror of what lies beyond it. For perhaps the curse was never about death at all, but about our inability to face the vastness of time, to accept that there are places where memory is stronger than flesh and silence heavier than truth. And even now, when the tomb stands open and its treasures rest behind glass, the feeling remains. Step too close, and you might still feel it, the faint breath of something ancient, patient, and unseen. The desert was a world of silence, vast, endless, and ancient. Beneath the burning Egyptian sun, the Valley of the Kings shimmered like a mirage of golden bones. To the ordinary traveler, it was a place of beauty. To those who knew its history, it was a graveyard of gods and kings and watchers who never slept. When the first expedition team camped near Tutankhamun's tomb in 1923, they noticed something odd, shadows that moved even when no one was near, and whispers that fluttered like sand through the air. At night, the wind seemed to chant a name over and over, Ankhesenamun. Ankhesenamun, the young queen who vanished after the boy king's death. Lord Carnarvon, still recovering from the fever that nearly killed him, awoke one night drenched in sweat. The tent lantern flickered wildly, though there was no breeze. Standing outside his tent was a figure, tall, slender, and wrapped in linen that shimmered faintly under the moonlight. Its face was hidden, but the eyes burned with the faint blue of the Nile at twilight. "Who are you?" Carnarvon rasped, clutching his chest. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised a hand, bony, regal, and pointed toward the cliff that loomed behind the valley. There, carved into the rock, was something the archaeologists hadn't noticed before. Faint hieroglyphs that glowed with a dull gold light. Carter, called moments later, translated them in stunned silence. "Those who disturb the house of eternity," he whispered, "shall awaken those who guard it." For centuries, the Egyptians believed in eternal watchers, the invisible sentinels placed by the high priests to guard royal tombs. not merely spirits, but echoes of divine will. They were said to linger at the edge of the living world, punishing any mortal who crossed the boundary between reverence and greed. Carter laughed nervously. Superstition, he said, though his hands trembled. But that night, as the team slept, one of the guards screamed. When they rushed out, they found him kneeling before the tomb's entrance, his eyes wide open, his pulse silent. His last words, barely audible, were in Arabic. "They're watching." By morning, his footprints led away from the tomb, deep, erratic, and then gone, as if the desert itself had swallowed him whole. Something had awakened in the Valley of the Kings, and the world would soon remember that some graves were never meant to be opened. The following day, Carter stood before the tomb entrance, his eyes fixed on the dark opening that had once thrilled him with discovery. Now, it seemed to breathe, a slow, rhythmic exhalation of cold air from the depths of eternity. Inside, the lanterns flickered as if unseen hands passed before them. The team proceeded carefully, but the silence of the corridor was unbearable. The walls, painted with scenes of gods and offerings, seemed different now, their eyes sharper, their faces less serene. One of the local workers muttered prayers under his breath, clutching a small amulet shaped like the Eye of Horus. Carter, though not a man of faith, could not shake the feeling that they were being observed, not by men, but by something far older. Deep within the burial chamber, the golden shrine of Tutankhamun stood gleaming, untouched. Yet something new had appeared overnight. On the lid of a clay jar rested a scarab, black as obsidian and very much alive. It crawled slowly toward Carter's hand, then stopped. Its shell bore markings that shimmered faintly under the light. Not random, but deliberate. "Look," Carter whispered. "Those symbols, they match the glyphs on the cliff." The scarab froze, as though hearing his words, and then, without warning, cracked open, releasing a faint hiss of sand. Inside was nothing. No insect, no body, just dust. That same night, Carter recorded a strange occurrence in his journal. The temperature dropped without reason. Carnarvon's fever has returned, and several of the men refused to enter the tomb. I hear footsteps outside my tent long after midnight, though no one is there. The desert feels awake. Meanwhile, in Cairo, reports began to spread. The lights of the city flickered for hours. Dogs howled in unison, and several witnesses claimed to see a pale figure standing atop the train station roof, tall, motionless, and wrapped in linen. Newspapers called it hysteria, but one reporter dared to print the headline. A few days later, another tragedy struck. Evelyn White, one of the assistant archaeologists, was found in his room, lifeless. Around his neck hung a piece of papyrus with hurriedly scrawled hieroglyphs. When translated, they read, "I have called upon the gods of Egypt to forgive my trespass." The line below was written in English, almost like confession. They are not myths. They see everything. Carter, now weary and pale, tried to maintain composure, telling the press that fear and superstition were spreading faster than reason. Yet even he began to sense that something followed him, a presence that lingered just beyond his sight, reflected faintly in mirrors or flickering across his tent wall at night. In one of his final diary entries of that season, he wrote, "If there are watchers, they do not seek revenge. They seek remembrance." But remembrance, as Carter would soon learn, came at a terrible cost.